Ethan nodded, but his mind was still heavy with Bonner's sacrifice. Yeah, but it came at a cost, he replied. The two of them stood together, looking out over the battlefield. They had survived the impossible. And in the process, they had learned something profound about each other, and about humanity. The smoke from the battle had begun to clear, and the once chaotic forest was now eerily quiet. The air was heavy with the aftermath of the conflict, and the ground beneath their feet was littered with the remnants of destroyed alien drones and damaged war machines. Yet, despite the devastation, there was a sense of relief among the survivors. The fight was over, and they had won. For now, Earth was safe. Ethan stood at the edge of the battlefield, his eyes scanning the horizon. His face was dirt-streaked, and his body ached from the brutal combat. His thoughts, however, were far away, lost in the weight of what had happened. The memories of the battle were still fresh in his mind, the loss of his friend Bonner, the countless close calls, and the immense danger they had faced. But amidst it all, there was one thing that had kept him going: Liara. Liara, the alien rebel who had become more than just an ally. She had become a friend, a teammate, and something more, something he couldn't quite put into words. Their bond had been forged through the heat of battle, through shared moments of danger, and through the trust they had built in each other. It was a connection unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced before. As the battle subsided, Liara's people arrived. Sleek, advanced ships from her rebel faction descended through the thick smoke, their engines humming softly as they touched down. The moment they landed, armed guards stepped out, their presence commanding and efficient. They had come to extract Liara, to take her back to the safety of their rebellion. The mission was complete, and it was time for Liara to leave. Ethan turned to face her, his heart heavy. He had known this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Liara walked toward him, her steps slow and deliberate. She looked different now. The armor she had worn during the battle was gone, and in its place, she wore a simple cloak that billowed around her as she walked. Her eyes, though, were the same, intense, yet full of gratitude. They locked eyes for a long moment, saying everything that words could not. "I'm ready to leave, Ethan," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. "My people are here, and it's time for me to go." Ethan nodded, swallowing the lump that had formed in his throat. He had known this moment would come, but that didn't make it any easier. Liara had become a part of his life, and now she was leaving. He wasn't sure what to say. What could he say? The words seemed inadequate in the face of everything they had shared. "You'll be safe now," Ethan said, his voice rough. "You've got your people, your rebellion. You'll fight your war, and you'll win." Liara smiled faintly. "I will, thanks to you. You've been more than just a friend, Ethan. You've been a hero. I won't forget what you did for me." Ethan looked down at his boots, unsure of what to say next. He hadn't done it for recognition, for fame, or for glory. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. He had done it for Liara. And for Earth. "Don't forget Earth either," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know we're small compared to your people, but we've got something worth protecting. And maybe one day we'll be able to help you." Liara's eyes softened, and she reached out to touch his arm. "I promise you, I won't forget. Earth, and you." She paused, her voice growing quieter. "I'll return someday, Ethan. When all this is over, when the war is won, I'll come back. And when I do, I'll make sure you'll be there waiting for me." Ethan felt a surge of emotion that he couldn't quite name. It was a mixture of hope, longing, and a deep connection that he couldn't explain. "I'll be waiting," he said quietly, his words heavy with meaning. The moment between them seemed to stretch on forever, but eventually, Liara stepped back, her eyes still fixed on Ethan. She turned to face the ship that had landed, her cloak flowing behind her like a shadow. The guards who had arrived with her began to move forward, and the soft hum of the ship's engines grew louder as the ship prepared for takeoff. Ethan watched her, unable to take his eyes off her. He knew that this was it, the end of their journey together, the end of their time fighting side by side. But it was also the beginning of something else. A new chapter. A new bond that neither time nor distance could break. As Liara climbed aboard her ship, she turned to give him one last look. Her expression was filled with gratitude, sadness, and something more, something he couldn't quite define. Ethan could only watch as she disappeared into the ship, her form slowly vanishing behind the sleek, metallic doors. The ship's engines roared to life, and with a final wave, Liara's ship took off into the night sky, rising higher and higher until it was nothing more than a dot in the distance. Ethan stood there, his heart heavy, his mind racing. The night around him was quiet again, save for the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Shadow, his loyal dog, stood by his side, as always. Ethan reached down to scratch behind Shadow's ears, his mind still processing everything that had happened. Liara had come into his life like a storm, bringing chaos and danger, but also a sense of purpose and meaning that he had never known before. Now, she was gone. But she wasn't really gone, not entirely. Her promise echoed in his mind, a promise that one day, she would return. And when she did, he would be waiting. For now, though, he had Earth to protect. His home. The place he loved. "Come on, Shadow," Ethan muttered, turning back toward the forest. "Let's go home." With Shadow by his side, Ethan made his way back through the woods, the sounds of the forest around him providing a comforting backdrop to the quiet moment. The stars above shone brightly, and the world seemed peaceful once again, as if nothing had ever happened. But Ethan knew better. He knew that the world was always on the brink of something, danger, adventure, change. But it was in the face of all that uncertainty that he had found something truly remarkable, trust. In Liara, in himself, and in humanity's ability to stand against the odds and fight for what mattered. As he walked through the darkened forest, Ethan knew that his life had been forever changed. He had met an alien, fought alongside her, and experienced a bond that defied all logic. And though Liara was gone for now, the memories of their time together would stay with him forever. And one day, when the time was right, she would return. And when she did, they would pick up right where they left off. For now, Ethan knew that he would always carry the memories of their journey in his heart, memories of survival, trust, and the unexpected friendships that formed in the face of danger. Liara took a shaky breath and winced in pain. "I'm part of a rebel group," she began, her voice low and strained. "My people, we've been at war with the Zaldar Empire for years. A brutal, oppressive regime. They've destroyed everything we hold dear. Our world, our families, we've lost so much." Ethan's heart tightened as he listened. He had known she was important, but this was something entirely different. She wasn't just a lost alien, she was a warrior, a survivor, someone with a cause far greater than anything he could comprehend. But what had happened to her? Why was she here, alone, on Earth? "I'm sorry," Ethan said quietly. "But why did they send you here? Why didn't they send a whole army? Why just you?" Liara's gaze met his, and for a moment, her eyes softened. "I wasn't supposed to be here alone," she said, her voice breaking. "I was part of a mission, an infiltration. But something went wrong. My ship was attacked, and I was the only one who survived. I was trying to contact my people, to warn them." Ethan could feel the weight of her words. It was clear now, Liara wasn't just some innocent bystander. She was carrying a message, something important that could change the fate of her people. And now, she was in his cabin, exhausted and on the run, with only him to protect her. The stakes had just become much higher. Before he could ask more, a low hum filled the air. Ethan froze. The drones. They were here. He hurried to the window, his breath catching in his throat. A massive, sleek drone appeared in the distance, hovering just above the tree line. Its metal surface glinted under the moonlight, and its many sensors were scanning the forest with precision. The drone was searching for them, and Ethan knew they had mere minutes before it found them. "Liara," Ethan said urgently, "can you do anything about that?" Liara's eyes were filled with fear, but there was also a glimmer of determination. "I'll try," she whispered. She raised her hand and began to focus. Ethan watched in awe as a faint blue light flickered around her fingers. She was trying to tap into her technology, trying to disrupt the drone's sensors. It wasn't easy, he could see her struggling, her body trembling from the effort. But then, with a sudden flash of light, the drone's sensors flickered and went dark for a split second. It was just enough time for Ethan to make a move. "Let's go." Ethan barked, grabbing his backpack and rushing to the door. Shadow, who had been alert the entire time, darted out first, leading the way into the woods. Ethan helped Liara up, and they ran into the darkness, hoping to make it deeper into the forest. The drone's systems buzzed back to life, and within seconds, it resumed its search, locking onto their trail. The next few moments were a blur of panic and adrenaline. Ethan could hear the drone following them, its searchlights slicing through the night. They had to move fast. Every second counted. The hum of the drone's engines was growing louder. Liara was struggling, but with every step, she seemed to summon more strength. She was trying to protect them, to keep the hunters at bay. Ethan knew they were out of time. The drone was closing in, and it wouldn't stop until it found them. And just as Ethan thought it couldn't get worse, a voice crackled over a hidden speaker, its metallic tone chilling him to the bone. "Target located. Locking coordinates. Preparing to engage." The fight for survival was far from over. The quiet of the forest was shattered by the sudden whine of the massive drone's engines as it swooped down toward the cabin. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing as he realized the situation was escalating faster than he could prepare for. The drone had locked onto their location with deadly precision, and it wasn't coming alone. A wave of alien soldiers appeared from the shadows, advancing through the trees with terrifying efficiency. Their cloaking devices flickered, revealing their advanced technology, powerful, dangerous, and relentless. Ethan grabbed his rifle and ran to the cabin's door, peering through the window to assess the incoming threat. Shadow stood by his side, ears alert, body tense, ready to spring into action. Liara was still weak, but she was working furiously to activate her own technology. Her hands moved quickly, fingers dancing over a series of small devices hidden in her armor. Sparks flew as her tech powered up, and the sound of mechanical whirring filled the air. Suddenly, the ground trembled as the first blast struck the cabin. The drone had fired a concentrated energy blast, leaving a large, smoldering hole in the side of the structure. Ethan's stomach churned at the sight, but there was no time to panic. He grabbed a laser pistol from his gear bag, loaded it quickly, and set to work fortifying the cabin. "It's coming," Liara said, her voice steady but strained as she activated a shield generator. The faint blue glow surrounded the cabin, forming a protective barrier that would hopefully buy them some time. Her face was pale, but she was determined, there was no turning back now. Ethan turned to her, nodding. "You need to keep the shields up. I'll cover the entrance." He adjusted his rifle, preparing for the incoming assault. The first alien soldiers broke through the trees, their cloaking devices deactivating as they closed in. They wore sleek black armor, their movements swift and deadly. Their weapons were raised, but before they could take aim, Liara's tech fired back. A high-pitched hum filled the air as laser beams shot out from hidden turrets mounted on the cabin, striking the soldiers with precision. The blast sent several of them flying back, their bodies crumpling as they hit the ground. But there were too many. For every soldier Liara took down, another appeared. Ethan could see them surrounding the cabin, moving swiftly in teams, working together with the cold efficiency of a predator. The drone, hovering just above the treetops, was now joined by two smaller drones that darted through the forest, scanning for any sign of weakness. It was a full-scale assault. Ethan fired his rifle, taking down one of the alien soldiers who was about to breach the door. But there was no time to celebrate the victory. He could hear more footsteps approaching, and the situation was quickly turning into a bloodbath. Shadow barked furiously, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He turned toward the dog, who was standing at the edge of the clearing, looking out into the dense forest. The dog's keen senses had picked up something, a movement in the shadows. "Shadow, stay close!" Ethan shouted, but it was too late. Out of nowhere, a massive blast tore through the air, knocking Ethan back against the wall of the cabin. His vision blurred for a moment, and he struggled to regain his bearings. Liara, still standing near her console, was struggling to keep the shield up, but it was weakening under the onslaught. She was running out of power. "Ethan, we can't hold them off much longer." Liara gasped, her fingers trembling as she worked to reroute power to the shield generators. But the energy levels were dangerously low. Ethan gritted his teeth, determination burning in his chest. He wasn't going to let them die here, not after everything they had been through. He took a deep breath and charged toward the door, preparing to face the next wave of soldiers. As the door flung open, Ethan was met by the cold stare of an alien soldier in black armor, a plasma rifle aimed straight at his chest. Without thinking, Ethan dropped to the ground, rolling to the side as the soldier fired. The blast missed by inches, and in one fluid motion, Ethan drew his combat knife and lunged at the soldier. The two locked in a brutal hand-to-hand struggle, the soldier's armored fists hammering down on Ethan's chest, but the human soldier was faster, more agile. Using his military training, Ethan ducked under a powerful strike and plunged his knife into the alien's side, narrowly avoiding the soldier's attempt to retaliate. The soldier crumpled to the ground, but there was no time to relish the victory. Another soldier appeared, his weapon raised. Ethan barely had time to react as he was forced to dodge the incoming blast. The alien was quick, faster than anything he had encountered before, and the pressure was mounting. He could feel the sweat dripping down his face as he fought to stay focused. "Liara!" Ethan yelled, hoping she could buy him some time. Just as the alien soldier closed in for another strike, Liara's voice rang out, commanding and fierce. "Cloak us now." Ethan barely had time to react before the cabin shimmered, and the light around them flickered. In an instant, they vanished from sight, the advanced cloaking technology surrounding them, rendering them invisible to the naked eye. But the cloaking wouldn't last long. Ethan knew they had mere moments before the soldiers would realize they were still inside. He grabbed his rifle, quickly scanning the area for any sign of the alien soldiers. The sound of engines overhead made his blood run cold. The drones were circling again. "I'm not sure how much longer I can keep us hidden," Liara said, her voice tight with strain. She was working furiously to maintain the cloaking field, but it was clear that her energy reserves were dangerously low. The tension was unbearable. Ethan's muscles were aching from the constant action, but there was no time to rest. He had to keep fighting. He had to protect Liara. Suddenly, a loud noise pierced the air, a loud crash, followed by the sound of a vehicle tearing through the trees. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Had they been found? A shadow appeared in the clearing, and to Ethan's surprise, a human figure emerged from the darkness. "Ethan," the man shouted, his voice familiar. "You're not alone." It was another human. A soldier. The newcomer raised his weapon and immediately opened fire on the advancing aliens. The air was filled with blaster fire as the two humans worked in sync to take down the alien soldiers. With the reinforcements, the odds had shifted, just slightly. But there was no time to relax. The situation was still dire. The drones were getting closer, and the soldiers were regrouping, preparing for another assault. Ethan knew this battle was far from over. They had been given a reprieve, but they weren't out of danger yet. Liara, her energy almost depleted, looked at Ethan with gratitude in her eyes. "We're not done yet," she whispered, her voice filled with determination. And neither were they. The battle for survival was just beginning, the air was thick with smoke and the sound of distant explosions as Ethan and his group prepared for their final stand. The aliens had pushed them to the edge, but now, with reinforcements on the way, they were ready to fight back. Liara stood beside Ethan, her eyes sharp and filled with determination. The battle was far from over, but there was a glimmer of hope on the horizon. The ground shook as the first blast from the orbital bombardment struck the alien ships above. The night sky lit up with the fiery explosion as the fleet, comprised of sleek ships from Liara's rebel faction, launched an assault on the enemy's heavy warships hovering high in the atmosphere. The explosions rained down from above, ripping through the air and briefly pushing back the alien hunters. For a moment, there was a temporary lull in the chaos, a precious window of time that Ethan and Liara could use to regroup. "We've got a moment." Ethan shouted to his team, urging them to prepare for the next wave of attackers. The hunters were relentless, but with the help of the fleet above, they had a chance. The Allied ships swooped down from the skies like shadows, their advanced technology blindingly fast as they descended to the forest floor. The smooth, metallic surfaces of their ships gleamed in the night, and the sound of their engines was a welcome relief to the weary human soldiers. Liara's allies, fellow members of the rebel group she had spoken of, were here. "Hold them off. We need more time." Liara shouted as she quickly activated her remaining tech. The ship's sleek metallic hull shimmered as it deployed energy barriers around their group, protecting them from incoming fire. Liara's people were no strangers to combat, and they came prepared. As the advanced ships landed with precise, military-like timing, Ethan and the soldiers took their positions, fighting side by side with Liara's rebel group. The forest became a war zone, the sound of blasters, exploding drones, and the growl of weapons echoed as they fought back against the relentless alien force. The aliens didn't give up easily. A new wave of heavily armored soldiers, followed by AI-controlled drones, charged into the fray. These drones were faster, more agile, and had almost no weakness. They swooped through the trees, firing deadly plasma bolts and cutting down anything in their path. Despite their technology, the humans stood their ground, armed with laser rifles and other advanced weaponry, firing relentlessly at the invaders. Ethan had never felt so alive, his body moving with the same precision and intensity it had during his days in combat. He dove behind cover, taking shots at the drones that passed by. Every shot was calculated, every movement decisive. His military training was paying off. But just when it seemed like the tide had turned, the aliens unleashed their most powerful weapon, an enormous energy cannon, hovering just above the battlefield. The cannon's massive barrels hummed with power as it targeted the Allied ships. The sky crackled with energy as the cannon charged up, ready to fire. "Ethan, we can't let that thing fire." Bonner, one of Ethan's fellow soldiers, shouted over the roar of the battle. Bonner was a tough, no-nonsense man, always ready to throw himself into danger to protect the group. "I'll take care of it. You cover me." Ethan's eyes widened in horror. "No, Bonner. You're not going alone." But Bonner was already running, his rifle raised, charging towards the massive cannon. Ethan tried to stop him, but there was no time to argue. Bonner was already a figure in the distance, running toward the enemy with a sense of urgency. "Cover him!" Ethan yelled to the others, and they followed his lead, shooting at the alien soldiers trying to stop Bonner from reaching the cannon. The roar of the battle grew louder as Bonner reached the base of the cannon, the enemy soldiers firing at him from all sides. He ignored the gunfire, pushing forward with a sense of grim determination. Ethan watched, heart racing, as Bonner set his explosive charges around the cannon's power core. Then, in a moment of sheer bravery, Bonner detonated the charges. The resulting explosion sent shockwaves through the forest, knocking Ethan off his feet. The cannon exploded in a brilliant burst of light, sending debris flying in all directions. The alien forces staggered, momentarily disoriented by the blast. But as the smoke cleared, Ethan's heart sank. Bonner was lying in the rubble, blood staining the ground beneath him. He had given his life to save them all. No. Ethan's voice broke as he rushed forward, but it was too late. Bonner was gone. Liara, seeing the grief on Ethan's face, walked up to him quietly. She knew the pain of losing a comrade, of losing anyone, and she understood the weight of sacrifice. "This is what it means to be human," she said softly. Her voice held both admiration and sadness. "You fight for each other, even when it seems like all hope is lost." Ethan stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of Bonner's sacrifice. He had given everything to protect them, to protect the future of humanity. The loss hit Ethan hard, but it also ignited a fire in his chest. Bonner's death would not be in vain. They had to win this. "Bonner's death won't be forgotten," Ethan whispered, clenching his fists. "We're going to finish this." With renewed determination, Ethan turned back to the battle. Liara, sensing his resolve, stepped forward, using her remaining energy to activate her final weapon, an energy pulse that rippled through the air, striking down dozens of alien soldiers at once. The combined forces of the rebel fleet and the humans created a wall of firepower that began to turn the tide of battle. The alien forces, once so certain of their victory, began to retreat under the relentless pressure. As the battle raged on, the final blow came from above. A strike from one of Liara's fleet ships slammed into the largest remaining enemy vessel. The ship exploded, sending flames and debris raining down from the sky. With their forces shattered and their ship destroyed, the alien invaders had no choice but to flee, retreating into the darkened skies, leaving behind a battlefield that was now quiet except for the crackling of fire and the distant echoes of victory. Ethan stood, breathing heavily, his body covered in dirt and sweat. The fight was over. They had won. But the victory felt bittersweet. They had lost so much along the way. Liara approached him, her eyes filled with respect and understanding. She had seen what humans were capable of, how their emotions, their courage, and their willingness to fight for one another made them stronger than any technology or alien force. "We did it," Liara said softly, her voice full of gratitude. It was a quiet night in the dense forest surrounding Ethan's cabin. The only sound that could be heard was the occasional rustling of leaves in the cool breeze and the distant chirp of crickets. Ethan, a rugged, battle-worn man with a past filled with secrets, sat in his cabin. His loyal dog, Shadow, lay peacefully by the door, his eyes half closed, but always alert. It was just another night, until everything changed. Without warning, the peaceful silence was shattered. A deafening roar echoed through the air, followed by the explosive crackle of burning metal. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Shadow's ears perked up, and he growled lowly, sensing something unusual. Both man and dog leapt to their feet, eyes wide with surprise. They had no idea what had just happened, but something massive had crashed into the forest. Ethan grabbed his coat, fastening it quickly as his eyes scanned the night. "Shadow, stay close," he ordered, his voice steady, though a storm of questions filled his mind. What was that? A plane crash? A meteor? It didn't sound like anything he'd ever heard before. The crash was too close, too violent. Shadow barked, urging him to move faster, and Ethan took off, running into the forest without hesitation. The dark trees were a blur as he sprinted, guided only by the faint glow on the horizon where the crash had occurred. The closer they got, the more intense the light became. It wasn't the soft, natural glow of a distant fire, it was an eerie, unnatural light, flickering in strange colors that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. As they approached the crash site, Ethan slowed down, trying to move cautiously. His heart was pounding now, not just from the run, but from an instinctual sense of danger. Something was off, this wasn't a simple accident. The glow in the sky pulsed with a strange rhythm, like a heartbeat. The forest around him seemed to be holding its breath, and even Shadow, usually so fearless, stayed close to Ethan's side, his eyes scanning the shadows. Finally, they arrived at the source of the crash. What lay before them was something that Ethan couldn't believe. A large, twisted mass of metal and glowing technology was scattered across the forest floor. Trees were uprooted and scorched, their blackened trunks leaning at unnatural angles, as if they had been caught in the explosion. There were sparks crackling from the wreckage, sending brief flashes of light into the air. Ethan's eyes widened as he took in the scene. This wasn't any aircraft he had ever seen, this was alien. The metallic surface was unlike anything made on Earth, reflecting the moonlight in shimmering blues and purples. The pieces of the ship were jagged, like it had been torn apart by some powerful force. Whatever had hit this ship had left it in ruins. Then, Ethan noticed something even stranger. In the center of the wreckage, half buried under debris and charred trees, was a glowing pod. The pod was small but sleek, made of the same strange material as the ship. The surface of the pod seemed to pulse with light, casting eerie shadows across the wreckage. And there, inside the pod, was something that made Ethan's stomach drop. A figure. Ethan rushed forward, his boots crunching against the charred ground, with Shadow close behind. As they neared the pod, Ethan's eyes locked onto the figure inside. It was an alien, a young woman, her body covered in shimmering blue skin that glowed faintly in the dark. Her eyes were closed, and she appeared unconscious, but her breathing was shallow, labored. Ethan knelt beside the pod, trying to assess the situation. The girl was clearly injured, her limbs were twisted awkwardly, and several parts of her technology were malfunctioning, sparking and fizzling with unstable energy. She didn't look like any alien Ethan had ever imagined. She wasn't monstrous or terrifying, instead, she seemed fragile, almost human. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Could he help her? Should he? This was unlike anything he had ever experienced. But something in the alien's eyes, even though they were closed, told him she was not a threat. There was a look of pain in her features, and her body was still trembling from the crash. "Shadow, stay," Ethan ordered, and the dog obediently sat back, watching the scene carefully, his body tense but not aggressive. Ethan reached for the damaged pod, his hand steady as he tried to assess the control panel. Sparks flew from it, and he quickly pulled his hands back. This wasn't something that could be fixed without proper tools, and even then, it was beyond his expertise. He glanced at the girl again, feeling a strange sense of responsibility. Despite the fact that she was clearly not human, there was a desperation in her expression that tugged at him. It was the kind of look that only someone in true need of help would have. Ethan made a decision. "I can't just leave you here," he murmured, more to himself than to the alien girl. He began carefully digging away at the wreckage around the pod, trying to free her without causing further harm. As he worked, the girl's eyes fluttered open, and her gaze immediately locked with his. The light from the pod reflected off her silvery eyes, and for a moment, the forest seemed to fall away. There was something otherworldly about her, but there was also something painfully familiar. The girl's lips parted as if she was about to speak, but no words came out, only a faint, unintelligible hum. Her eyes conveyed a message of intense gratitude, but also fear. Her alien mind was racing, trying to communicate, but she was too weak to do so effectively. Her body was shaking, and her breathing became more erratic. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he watched her struggle. He quickly leaned closer, trying to make her more comfortable, though he had no idea how. "Hey, it's all right," he said, his voice softer now, trying to calm her. "I'm here to help." For a moment, it felt as though time stood still. The alien girl's eyes widened, and then her gaze flickered briefly toward the wreckage, as if sensing something Ethan couldn't. Her eyes met his again, filled with fear not of him, but something else. A warning. The sound of distant engines, low and humming, drifted through the trees, faint but growing louder. Ethan froze. What was that? The girl's eyes went wide in panic, and she tried to speak, but her voice was still too weak. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against Ethan's chest. Her grip was weak, but the urgency in her touch was clear. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with enough terror to send chills down Ethan's spine. Before he could ask any questions, the sound of approaching engines grew louder, much louder. Something, or someone, was coming for her. Ethan's heart raced as he knelt beside the alien girl, Liara. He wasn't sure what to do first, he had never encountered anything like this before. The metallic pod she had been trapped in was still sparking intermittently, and Liara's body was riddled with bruises and burns. Her once glowing blue skin was now dull, and her eyes, although filled with desperation, were clouded with pain. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to push aside the confusion and fear that threatened to overwhelm him. He couldn't leave her here. No matter who, or what, she needed help. His training as a former soldier kicked in, and he reached into his backpack, pulling out medical supplies he always kept for emergencies. As he gently applied the bandages and salves to her wounds, Liara's eyes flickered open again, watching him with an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. Her breathing was labored, and every time she tried to speak, the words seemed to be stuck. Her mouth moved, but only faint sounds escaped. Ethan glanced at her tech, the malfunctioning device clutched tightly in her hand. It was blinking erratically, sparks flying from it as if it were on the verge of exploding. But before it could, the device let out a burst of static. Liara's eyes widened in recognition, and she whispered something barely audible, her voice shaky but urgent. "Distress signal, sending." Ethan's brow furrowed in confusion. She was trying to send out a distress signal. He hadn't been able to make heads or tails of the device, but it was clear it was important. He tried to adjust the device, but his fingers trembled as he struggled to understand its alien mechanics. The flashing lights became more erratic, signaling the device was failing. Liara's body tensed, as if she was trying to communicate her frustration. She was trying to call for help, but the signal was broken. Suddenly, a sharp bark from Shadow pulled Ethan from his thoughts. He whipped his head around, and his stomach sank. In the distance, through the trees, he saw movement. Dark, indistinct shapes shifting among the shadows. Ethan's eyes narrowed, and his heart beat faster. The shapes were cloaked, camouflaged in the same way an invisible predator might move through the forest. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the air seemed to grow thicker with tension. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't human. "Shadow, stay close," Ethan muttered under his breath, his voice low and tense. His military instincts kicked into overdrive. Those weren't random figures. They were hunters, tracking them. And from the look of it, they weren't just here to capture her. They were here to kill. Ethan helped Liara to her feet, her body trembling under his touch. "We need to move," he said urgently, his voice steady but filled with an unspoken fear. Shadow, sensing the danger, was already on alert, his ears perked up and his body crouched low, ready to protect. Liara's eyes flickered between Ethan and the forest, but she was too weak to move quickly. Despite her injuries, she reached for her malfunctioning device and pressed it against her chest, trying to steady her breath. The alien technology sparked one last time, and to Ethan's surprise, a transparent blue shield materialized in front of them, a shield that looked like a barrier of pure energy, shimmering in the air. Ethan stepped back, surprised by her strength. The shield wasn't perfect, it flickered and sputtered, but it was enough to buy them some time. He could tell Liara wasn't just any alien, she had powers, advanced technology, and was clearly important. He wasn't dealing with an ordinary survivor of a crash, but someone who had the means to protect herself. "Can you walk?" Ethan asked, urgency thick in his voice. Liara nodded weakly but tried to stand, her legs wobbly. "I can," she whispered, her voice strained. "Help." Ethan nodded, stepping in front of her to shield her from view. We don't have much time. We need to go, now. Before Liara could respond, Shadow growled lowly, his eyes locked on something beyond the shield. Ethan turned just in time to see one of the cloaked figures emerge from the trees. It was humanoid, but its features were twisted and unnatural, covered in advanced armor that glimmered with high-tech camouflage. The hunter's face was obscured by a helmet, but its glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, scanning the area. The hunter's hand gripped a weapon, a sleek, black rifle that hummed with dangerous energy. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a search party, this was a military unit. And they had tracked Liara down. We have to run, Ethan whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. Shadow, take point. Without waiting for further instructions, the dog sprang forward, darting through the thick underbrush. Ethan took Liara's hand, guiding her as best as he could, his mind racing for a plan. The shield was still flickering, but it wouldn't hold for long. They had to make it to the edge of the forest, where there was a small clearing that led to an old, abandoned road. The hunters were closing in, and with every step Ethan took, he could feel the tension growing. They couldn't outrun them forever. Hold on, Liara, Ethan urged. We're getting out of here. They moved fast, Ethan weaving through the trees, Shadow leading the way. Liara stumbled but managed to keep up, her energy clearly spent. Each step seemed like an eternity as the sound of the hunters' footsteps grew louder behind them, the crackle of their cloaking devices barely masking their presence. It was clear that they had been trained to move silently, but Ethan had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, every part of him screamed that they were being hunted. The first shot rang out, a sudden flash of light cutting through the darkness. Ethan instinctively pushed Liara to the ground, his body protecting hers as the energy blast tore through the air. He could feel the heat of it, the pulse of raw power. Another shot followed, narrowly missing them. Liara gasped, her hand clutching Ethan's sleeve, her body trembling from fear and weakness. Despite her injuries, she reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers glowing with a faint, blue light. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, a force field materialized around them, rippling with energy. It was weaker than before, but it held, just enough to deflect the second blast. Ethan pushed Liara forward, urging her to move. We're almost there, he growled through gritted teeth. They were so close to the clearing when another cloaked figure appeared in their path. The hunter's weapon hummed with power, and Ethan's pulse quickened. They were trapped. But then Liara did something Ethan hadn't expected. She stood up, using every ounce of her remaining strength. With a burst of energy, she sent a shockwave through the air, knocking the hunter back. The figure stumbled, its cloak flickering as the energy blast sent it reeling. Ethan didn't wait. He grabbed Liara's hand and ran toward the clearing, feeling the brush of Shadow's fur against his leg as the dog led the way. The hunters weren't far behind, but the force field still held, flickering like a dying star, buying them precious moments. Just as they reached the edge of the forest, another shot rang out, but this time, it missed. Ethan and Liara burst into the clearing, the open space offering a brief respite from the chase. The hunters stopped at the tree line, their cloaking devices flickering as they considered their next move. Ethan turned to Liara, his voice filled with awe. "What are you?" he asked, his voice full of respect. Liara's eyes met his once more. "Not just anyone," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with a strange, urgent purpose. "I'm someone who can change everything." Ethan didn't know it yet, but Liara's true importance was only just beginning to unfold. The sound of crashing branches and heavy footsteps behind them echoed through the forest, sending chills down Ethan's spine. Despite their brief respite in the clearing, the reality of their situation hit hard. The hunters were relentless, and Ethan knew they couldn't run forever. Liara was weak, and every step she took seemed to drain her further. She had used all her remaining energy to create that protective shield, and now she was barely able to keep up. Ethan could feel the weight of his choices bearing down on him. He had never imagined his life would take this turn, running for his life with an alien girl he knew nothing about, being chased by hunters who were light years ahead of humanity in technology. His instincts told him to fight back, but logic screamed at him that it was a losing battle. These alien hunters weren't just skilled, they had technology that could rip through defenses with ease. They finally reached his cabin, a small, secluded wooden structure deep in the forest. Ethan had built it himself after retiring from the military, a place to escape the chaos of the world. But now, this small cabin seemed so fragile, surrounded by dense woods that wouldn't offer them much protection against the advanced technology tracking them. Still, it was the only safe place they had for the moment. Ethan quickly moved to the front door, glancing nervously over his shoulder. The sound of engines hummed in the distance, the drones. He could hear them. The AI-controlled hunters' drones were already sweeping through the forest, searching for them. The night air felt colder, and the weight of every passing second dragged on him. They were being hunted, and there was no denying it anymore. "Liara, you need to rest," Ethan said, his voice stern but filled with concern. He helped her inside, making sure she stayed on her feet. The alien girl leaned heavily against him, clearly exhausted. Her blue skin, which had once shimmered with an otherworldly glow, now appeared pale and dull under the dim light of the cabin. Her breathing was shallow, and Ethan could see the pain in her eyes. Despite all of the danger they were in, she managed to give him a weak smile, trying to reassure him. "I'll be fine," she whispered, though her voice was barely audible. Ethan didn't believe her. She was far from fine. Still, he didn't have time to argue. They needed to prepare for the worst. He quickly checked the cabin's perimeter, looking for anything he could use to defend them. His mind was racing. How could they fight back against technology that could dismantle them in seconds? He had military training, but even that didn't feel like enough. The reality of the situation was setting in, he was up against an enemy that was too powerful, too advanced. "Shadow, stay close," Ethan muttered to his dog, who was already scanning the area, his ears alert, tail stiff, and eyes sharp. The dog had been a loyal companion through thick and thin, but Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. What if this time wasn't like the others? What if this time they couldn't escape? He didn't have much time. Liara was slumped against the wall, her eyes fluttering shut as she rested. Ethan quickly moved to his workbench, trying to cobble together some kind of defense. His hands were shaking as he grabbed pieces of old tech he'd scavenged from his time in the military. He'd been good with electronics, but this was something else entirely. Whatever had attacked her ship, whatever was chasing them now, was far beyond anything humanity had ever encountered. As he worked in silence, Liara's faint voice broke the quiet. "Ethan," she spoke his name softly, as if gathering her strength to say something important. He turned to look at her, his eyes filled with worry. She seemed weak, but there was a fire in her eyes, a fire he hadn't seen before. "Tell me what happened," Ethan said gently, kneeling beside her. He needed to know more, to understand who he was risking his life for.